The El Paso shooting is far from the first time racism and hatred have motivated white men to commit mass murder. There was the man who shot and killed 3 people of color at a garlic festival in Gilroy, California last week. The shooter who murdered 11 worshipers at the Tree of Life Temple in Pittsburgh last fall. The student behind the 17 deaths at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High in Parkland, Florida. And the shooter responsible for 9 deaths in a Charleston, South Carolina church who has posted Nazi symbols online, and that's not even close to an exhaustive list. Some Democrats have made a direct link between such violence and the president's rhetoric, perhaps none more emphatically than El Paso's former Congressman, Beto O'Rourke.
You know the shit he's been saying? He's been calling Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals. Connect the dots about what he's been doing in this country. He's not tolerating racism, he's promoting racism. He's not tolerating violence, he's inciting racism and violence in this country.
But the president and his party have other culprits in mind.
We must recognize that the internet has provided a dangerous avenue to radicalize disturbed minds and perform demented acts. We must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace.
So which is it? Rhetoric, video games? Here with answers. Jack Levin, criminologist who's spent a career probing the minds of some of the worst criminals. And he's also the author of The Allure of Premeditated Murder. Nice to see you, Jack.
Thank you.
Along with Robert Mendoza. Robert's a neuropsychologist with Boston Forensic Associates. Robert, it's good to see you again, too. You know, common sense gun control opponents, the first place they go is the mental health thing, even though they don't do anything about that. We'll get to that in a minute. The one that was sort of added yesterday by Kevin McCarthy, the leader of the House Republicans, the president today, is video games. What role do video games, Jack? I think they play them in other countries too, don't they? What role do video games play in creating mass shooters?
Well, you know, there are studies that show that kids who play video games get angry, but they don't take up a semi-automatic and start shooting people. You know, I once had a student, a very nice student, by the way, very peaceful, who told me that when he watched a violent video game, he felt like kicking someone, but he never kicked anyone. I think that it's a mistake to blame it on video games.
Is there any there on the video game thing, Robert?
2015, the American Psychological Association came out with a study that looked at an analysis of lots of studies. They found that, just as Jack is saying, there is a link between aggression and video game playing. The problem is there's not enough specificity. What kinds of video games? How often are there other factors in that individual's life that might prompting them to do these kinds of things? And there's no relationship that we're aware of now between video games and mass murders.
Okay, so let's go to the common thread almost always, if you want to oppose common sense gun control, the mental health thing. And everybody in America says, can we profile these people? Actually, let me read you what the president said today. We must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence and make sure those people not only get treatment, but when necessary, involuntary confinement. Putting aside for the moment civil liberties issues, which is hard to put aside, but let's do it for a moment. Could we do what the president and thousands of, again, anti-gun control activists argue and essentially profile people with mental health issues before the fact?
So it's important to know the data on this thing. If you took all mass shootings, studies vary, but about 20 to 25% may have had some mental illness factor. So the shooter. So there's not a majority of them, not even whatsoever. But if you were even to take those individuals off of that map of statistics, that only would account for maybe 4% of the problems. And we know what to do to treat these individuals, because here's a great statistic. It's very telling. Of the people involved in mental health illness that get involved in or that get involved in any kind of violence, they have been the target of violence themselves. So if we provide better care for them to begin with, we take them off the map even more than that. So it's important to understand the scope of the problem to begin with.
So you're nodding in agreement there,
Yes,
Jack
I
Levin.
am.
So if you agree with all that,
Yeah.
does that head nodding mean we could also identify a potential shooter who's got a mental health issue, even if they're a small percentage of the mix,
I think
before the fact?
I think it's a mistake to focus on mental illness.
What should we focus on?
We should focus on warning signs, and there are warning signs. Often,
whether one has a mental health issue or not.
Look, there are millions of people who are depressed. They don't take up semi-automatics and kill people.
Greatest president we ever had. Had suffered
That's a
from
good
depression
point.
as well.
Yeah.
So go ahead. So what do you mean when you say warning signs?
For example, in mass murders at school, there's a culture of silence where students are afraid for some reason to turn in one of their peers when they hear a threat in the hallway. We've got to stop that. We've got to make sure that when a student, or anybody, not just a student, is making a threat, that person is turned into the principal or to an authority figure. And that would make a big difference. Break the culture of silence.
Well, here's the problem. I mean, when I started having this discussion with you, I had somewhat black hair, and Jack still had a great mustache.
Not tonight, for people just tuning in. You've been here before.
Been here before, and we've had the same discussion about the idea that we may not be able to identify every shooter, but if we look at the culture within a school, then maybe we can address people that we never knew would turn out to be one of these people, but ended up getting the help they needed, and they didn't turn out to be this person.
Okay, so when you've looked at school shooters, for example, and done an analysis like the one you talked about, I know it's easy to make predictions about what has already happened after the fact. Have you identified shooters who you said, had they done what the two of you suggested, that shooter wouldn't have had the opportunity to do what he or she did? Is there?
Oh, yes. There's a big study that was done by Eric Matfus in Washington State, who did exactly that and found that there were a number of schools where they were able to reduce the number of these mass murders at schools by identifying beforehand the threats in the hallway.
And do these warning sign things work in the general population? The schools are a relatively closed environment, and almost all of these this manifesto, admittedly, was just posted minutes before it happened. Had it been posted earlier, what would you have done with it if you just happened to be on whatever social media outlet and saw what this guy wrote about the Hispanic invasion of Texas? Anything?
Well, I think we should take it for what it is, a threat. It goes beyond just hatred. It actually is a threat to an entire group of people and goes beyond the First Amendment.
And a cop should go visit him at his house.
there should be something done.
And actually, there are organizations now, community-based teams made up of police officers, social workers, et cetera, that are looking to gather this data and make these semi-wellness checks to have these conversations.
Well, by the way, red flag laws, which the president, to his credit, endorsed today. He may have opposed them by dinner time, but he did embrace them this morning. You know, one of the things you have mentioned are guns. I mean, I know these are not new statistics. We have 2 times as many guns per capita as the second most gun-friendly nation in the country. And that nation, by the way, is involved in a civil war, Yemen. The pure availability and number of guns is a huge part of this, is it?
It is.
I mean, it's so obvious. To me, it's painful.
It is obvious. Australia had a horrendous massacre in 1996.
Port Arthur, right?
That's right. 35 people dead. And as a result, they banned all semi-automatics.
Conservative prime minister did that too, by the way.
That's true.
I mean, the problem is, once again, we don't need world-class Jack Levin. We heard somebody from the Ohio shooting, law enforcement, say these large-capacity magazines don't make sense. The message is out there. The question is there the political and social and whatever kind of courage you want to define out there to make these changes?
You know, even if the people in Congress don't care about real people, I assume they care, because they say they care, about members of law enforcement. Law enforcement in Dayton stormed that place 24 seconds. 24 seconds. I'm guessing. I haven't spoken to them. I'm guessing them. Every one of them would have preferred that shooter not have a semi-automatic weapon with a magazine with 100 cartridges in it. Why has that not generated any action on the part of an NRA scared Congress? They love law enforcement, do they not?
So I assume that's a rhetorical question.
It is a rhetorical question. Do you have a rhetorical answer?
You just
What's the one thing, you only have 15 seconds, one thing if you were the czar of gun safe, what's the one thing you would do to make this a safer country? One.
I would take out high-capacity ammunition and weapons that military people themselves say don't belong on American soil.
You have 15 seconds,
I don't need 15 seconds.
5.
I agree.
Fair enough. Robert, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Jack, pleasure as always.
Thank you.